Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for having us and giving us the opportunity to talk today about some of the legal and policy issues facing the geospatial community. I think, Kevin, I'm excited to be here with you. And
yeah, I appreciate the opportunity as well. Maybe we can, we've had a number of conversations over the past year or so about this topic, but not in front of a group this large, so it'll be good. I was going to make a few. So actually, what started this dialogue between us was an NGAC meeting, a year or so ago, maybe. And I sort of gave my perspective on things, right? So I started out as a satellite imagery analyst, but I've been practicing law for way many years too many years, right? But I've been struck by a couple of things around the geospatial community in law, right? One is that this community doesn't like to talk about law. The NSDI, the definition includes policy, standards, procedures, never mentions law, right? We talk about open data, and I know this is an open data community, but we don't talk about licensing as much and the complexities associated with licensing, even with open data. We talk about, instead of intellectual property, we often talk about digital rights management. Instead of privacy, we talk about ethics. And I get it to some extent. I don't like to talk to lawyers any more than you do. But there's a lot of legal issues that are associated with the work that we're doing, right? And I say we because I feel like I'm part of this community, but I know I'm separate enough that, not everyone agrees with that. So that's one aspect of it that I think is important. The second aspect of it is the legal issues around data are really complex. And we haven't been taught this in law school until recently. But it's very different than software. It's very different than the other things that have been doing. And so to think that you can seamlessly do data sharing or aggregation, it's not that simple from a legal standpoint, unfortunately. There's a lot of uncertainty, and there aren't many lawyers that frankly understand it. And so what I'm seeing is, and we could talk about this a little bit later, is all this attention on AI and the laws and regulations that are developing on it, I think are going to have a significant impact on this community because people are starting to focus on data, particularly with the generative AI, both on the training data side. We've got issues around privacy, intellectual property rights, licensing, liability, national security, and then also on the output side. And so I think some of these issues are going to become more important. And so that's why I think this is a really interesting time for this discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. Your initial opening comments brought a question to mind for me that we didn't really talk about, but I think it's an easy one because you made a distinction between law and policy and public policy. And I know since you and I have interacted 3 or 4 times in depth on this topic, and it was kind of an aha moment to me to go, well, law isn't really. So can you talk a little bit about the differences between law and policy and how we might navigate those?
Yeah, so policies, let's talk about legal and policy frameworks, right? So the full gamut of laws, policies, regulations, agreements, best practices, standards. I mean, in my mind, they all sort of work together to create this legal and policy framework. But the difference about a law is it's prescriptive. It tells you what it can and can't do. And it is very broadly applied. And there's a legal basis for it, right? If you don't do it, there's a legal consequence associated with it. I compare that to a contract, which is also a legally binding agreement, has legal consequences if you don't comply, but that's only between the parties who are subject to the contract, right? Whereas laws applies to everyone that's within that group, right? So that's one aspect. Policies are something that's a little bit less. It's not law. You in general, you can't sue someone for not complying with a policy. From a legal standpoint, as you're a lawyer trying to figure out what you're going to do, I mean, your first thing is worrying about the law. Then you're thinking about, okay, what's the policies? There's an executive order that just came out today on cybersecurity. What does that ask me to do? Is there any legal consequence for not doing it? Then you get into best practices and standards. So all of these things contribute to it. But as a lawyer, the first thing you look at is what can or can't I do, or what am I required to do as a federal agency from a legal standpoint? And that's why the Geospatial Data Act to me is so interesting, because it took Circular A16, which was a policy, and turned it into a law. And now there are, and you can know this better than anyone, you're spending a lot of time complying with the law because people are paying attention because now Congress has told you to go do something. So I guess that would be, from your standpoint, how do you look at the work that you do between a law and policy, and how do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, you laid out a clear difference between law and policy. I think in practice, from my experience, I think we tend to treat them pretty similarly from a practitioner standpoint, right? So I don't say, well, this is in the Geospatial Data Act, but this is only an executive order. I mean, time gets a little tricky in there because sometimes there's, executive orders can be 10, 20, 30, 40 years old. And so sometimes the time aspect comes in there. But I do think, so we pay attention to OMB's Circular A16 and the Geospatial Data Act, as well as, department policy. And even on the FGDC side, as we start to execute more technical policy, that distinction is tricky. But you're right, it's the consequences and the authorities are different.
Well, and the point you made about, executive orders or policies being around for a bunch of years, it's a lot harder to change a law than it is a policy, right? So once you put something into law, you better get ready to deal with it for a long time because it's probably not going to change. Now, regulation has a lot of the same, assuming an agency, a law has given an agency the right to issue regulations pertaining to a certain subject. Those are easier to introduce or implement than a law, but it still has legal consequences associated with it, right? So that's another part of the framework. But I've done some work, internationally advising governments on legal and policy frameworks around this, and I try to tell them to think of the full spectrum in terms of what is a toolkit as to what you're going to do and what the impact is going to be. And I think even here in the United States, it's a way to look at it as well.
Yeah, that's great. Can you talk a little bit about, you mentioned some of the laws that are, the myriad of data law, for example, or intellectual property law. Can you talk a little bit about some of the things that this community should be aware of from a legal perspective? What are the, kind of guiding laws or policies out there? I mean, you mentioned the AI executive order as one that I think we're all trying to learn more about and understand completely. And then the intersection of that with geospatial is going to be an even more interesting kind of challenge for us as a community to understand and apply AI policy to geospatial. Yeah,
so certainly from a legal standpoint, from working with businesses, but also for you, I mean, the Geospatial Data Act is a big one, right? And then you've got other authorities that you're dealing with, within your department that have granted you certain authorities and responsibilities that you need to comply with. You have FSMA that you need to comply with. You have the FACA, Federal Advisory Committee. I mean, you've got all these authorities and rules and responsibilities that you need to comply with. And I think that applies, every agency has to do that. Every department has to do that. And that's sort of the baseline, right? And of what you need to deal with. And I don't think, I know I don't, and I don't know about the folks here, but I don't necessarily appreciate that's sort of, that you have to deal with that on a daily basis on top of the other things that you're doing, right? So the issues that I see, both here in the United States, at the state level, at the federal level, and then, even internationally, and they keep on coming up, no matter how developed the legal system is or the maturity of the geospatial, are issues around intellectual property, licensing, privacy is getting to be a big one, national security concerns, data quality and liability issues, and then sector-specific rules, right? So surveying at the state level, or drones at the federal level, or satellite if you're doing satellite. So all of those things are, I would consider, common set of issues that people need to deal with. And they take different forms, right? So copyright is at the federal level. There's a copyright law. But then there's case law that develops around how to apply that, right? Because it's very broad. So understanding what, for instance, copyright protection you can get in a database of facts is a challenge, right? Because it's typically facts aren't copyrightable. So, but now you've got, you try to add some creativity, so maybe it can't be copyrightable. And then you go to 5 minutes. Wait, is this a 5-minute talk?
No, we have, I think, we have 30 minutes, right, Eddie? Well, 5 minutes?
Yeah,
Oh, I don't know. I can't
Okay, 5 minutes. All right.
I can't see a thing.
Okay.
So, okay.
All right.
So you're gonna have to do better with the font there for my.
So
Yes, we do have 5.
okay. All right. So there's those bodies of law I think are really important.
I think we have more than 5 minutes.
Okay. I
go back. Keep going.
All right. Okay. We got an hour and a half. All right.
yeah. Yeah. Buckle up, everyone. So yeah, I think there's a series of law that fall on top of the work that you're doing. Right? Obviously, the FAR is important, right? You need to comply with the FAR, or if there's OTA. So, but all these issues on top of it, I think, make the geospatial community, it's more complex. So, location privacy is a really, really complex issue and something that we don't necessarily appreciate, but is something that needs to be there's going to be a growing importance. I don't know. People saw that just the other day, the Federal Trade Commission issued a pretty significant fine on telecom companies for selling location data on consumers, right? And probably when that first started, there wasn't any particular law in place that told them that they couldn't do it. And the FTC's authority has slowly evolved and has started to be more concerned about location privacy. And so these are the things that I think the geospatial community are going to be dealing with over the coming years.
Yeah. You want to ask me a question, or you want me to keep going?
Go ahead.
Okay. All right, I'm on a roll here. So one of the things I know in my role that I've struggled with is, this awareness. And you mentioned like the Federal Trade Commission ruling. I mean, when you walk into a federal or any role in this space, and you're faced with, I don't know what I don't know. What are the, how would you recommend somebody learn about what this legal and policy framework is that we all have to operate in? And I know when I came into this role, for example, like coming with a military background, I didn't have a huge experience with the Open Data, Act. It wasn't really something we really with several of the laws that are in place. And so, going, oh man, now I have to understand this, and I didn't even know it existed. So how would someone learn about what this framework looks like? Just Google, or?
I think, and we've talked about this on several occasions. I mean, I think the first challenge, or the first thing I would do, is to take your lawyer to lunch, right? And literally, if you have a lawyer within your organization, to take him or her to lunch and just talk about what it is you do and what your concerns are and what you're hearing, what you're seeing. And I think it's human nature for people not want to bring their lawyers into the process, right? There's a different jargon. It can be uncomfortable. If you're in the private sector, it can be expensive unless you can get them to agree to not to charge you to go to lunch. But their time is often, we tend to think we're busier as lawyers, and probably we are, but anyways, that makes it more difficult. But having those frank discussions about, this is what I'm doing, this is how we work, because most lawyers don't understand this sector, don't understand the work that you're doing, don't understand data yet at the level that you need them to understand. And we had a conversation this morning. I was thinking afterwards, a Department of Transportation lawyer is dealing with like 15 or 20 other things that have nothing to do with geospatial on a regular basis, right? So you've got to get their mind space to focus on this, and you need to get them out of the office, and you need to have this discussion and try to get them engaged, right? And so that's one thing. Another thing is I sort of have I have the flip side of that, which is I find when I talk to people about these issues and these topics, people are very welcoming. People thank me for talking about it. They say it's important. I get recognized in various aspects, but I don't think people think it applies to them. I think people think this is someone else's problem. This is someone else's national security problem. Someone else has a liability problem. I don't have to worry about privacy because I'm not in that space. I'm not collecting precise geolocation information. And I struggle with that because I think even if you don't do it, you're not dealing with it, your customers probably are, right? Or your government agency is oversight. I mean, and it's changing and evolving. So if you think that there's friction in your process and your sales process and your negotiating process, that may be part of it, particularly if you're selling to bigger organizations, whether it be big government agencies or big companies. They've got a bunch of lawyers that are looking at this, and if they don't understand data, if they don't understand privacy, and if they're just reading things in the newspaper. So I think it's important to sort of not just pigeonhole yourself, and pigeonhole is not the right word, but to think more broadly. And that's where you can find some of the answers to the questions, because it's out there. It's taking place right now. Like the privacy thing, if you see a privacy decision out there and you say, well, I'm not in that space, even though you're collecting geospatial information, it's knocking on your door, right? I mean, someone else is thinking about it, so you should be mindful as to what's happening in the privacy space. You should be mindful as to what's happening in the AI space, because those things are developing, and they don't say geospatial in front of them, but they're legal issues that are going to impact the geospatial community.
You mentioned AI, and so what are some of the legal issues around AI that you see coming up?
Well, a lot of them, I think, overlap to what I was just talking about before around geospatial, right? So privacy, the intellectual property issues are a big one. I don't know if you saw, but there have been a number of lawsuits regarding copyright, and there are several more dropped today. Yesterday around newspapers suing. There's a question as to whether it's fair use in the training data. Fair use is a very complex legal issue around copyright, and it's going to be fought out in the courts. And then depending on what the courts do, it may come out in Congress. But intellectual property rights is going to be a big thing. Web scraping is going to be part of it as well, right? So facts aren't copyrightable, as you know. But there is some laws around web scraping that are being developed, and so primarily through the courts, and that's being impacted by AI as well because of how a lot of the training data was collected. Privacy is a big concern. You're developing these privacy laws that are giving consumers a great deal of rights. It started in Europe and then went to California, then Virginia became the second. Now I think there's like 17 states, and how those are going to apply in an AI world is going to be really interesting, because the traditional concepts of notice and consent and being able to verify that your data is accurate is a real challenge. And there's a bill before Congress right now. It's a privacy bill. It has a significant AI component to it. But the way I read it, it suggests that if you were going to collect a volume of drone data or even satellite data, you arguably would have to get consent of the folks before you could use it. Now, I don't think anyone in the privacy community is looking at it that way, but that's the way I read it if you understand how this community works. The black box and the liability issues is going to be really interesting in terms of, and as a lawyer, how you protect yourself, you protect your clients from that. In a contract, if someone's using your data and then there's a mistake, is it your data? Is it the software? How is that generating? And then the national security concerns. So those are the body of issues. The other interesting thing that's developing around AI law is they're looking at regulating it at both the training data level and then the model level and then also the output level. So there's different levels involved, and the issues they're talking about are very complex, and it's really going to involve a bunch of stakeholders within the community or within an organization to make sure, because it's not just privacy, but it's discrimination. They're legislating ethics, including those in there. So there's a lot of complexity associated with it that I think is going to have an impact on the work that this community does.
All right.
I do have a question for you. How do you, so there's, the executive order came out around AI, came out in October of last year. There have been some developments since. I think something came out just the other day in terms of how agencies are doing and implementing. I think there's a list of how government agencies are using AI and how are you playing in that, or seeing your organizations that you work with play in that?
I mean, obviously, AI impacts all of us in a huge way. I think as a geospatial community, in some respects, we've been doing unclassified image classification for a long time, and what some people would say AI for NML for a long time. But I think understanding geospatial's role in AI and how much of it is geo AI and how much of it is it geospatially enabling artificial intelligence, not geospatial. I think that's going to be a huge challenge for us to understand. A lot of the things you've talked about already, right? Like just, okay, what does the executive order say? I think I would probably not be alone in the question. Folks in this room probably all have different understanding of whether they can go to ChatGPT on their government computer and ask a question, and what can they do with those results, right? And I've got everybody. My wife's at the Forest Service. She's like, we can't use it at all on our computers. You got people going, put this into ChatGPT, and then a staff call going, I used it, and this is what I learned, and so even our understanding of what's allowed at that level, I think is perhaps different at an agency by agency level, and it's a hugely complex field that also, I could speak for myself, right? Like I'm not an AI expert, so even understanding the space is a learning curve for me, let alone understanding that space and then taking that executive order, my department's policy, and going, can I, what can I and can't I do?
Yeah, it's really interesting because I give a talk at Johns Hopkins. I'm an instructor there, and it was on how AI in the classroom, right? And the first thing I realized is the universities, and I assume high schools as well, are really at the forefront of this, right? Because students are using it in everything that they do, and you're getting AI generated content back at you, and there's very few policies in place there as well, right? So they're dealing with it right now, where I think other agencies, including my law firm, we're still waiting for something to happen. I do think the 2 points you made that I really believe is going to be important for this community. One is because it's been using some form of AI for a while, right? Machine learning, however you want to describe it, it's going to be really important to understand what these laws allow and don't allow, because it could very easily impact things that you've been doing for years without without intending to do that, just because of the definition of what an AI system is. And believe me, there's as many different definitions of AI systems as there are laws or regulations looking into it. So that's going to be important in understanding what the requirements are, is whether it applies to you. The other aspect of that is, and you made this point, this community has been doing AI and machine learning for years, but it's not at the table at the discussions that are taking place around AI. There was an interagency task force that was created, or something similar that the White House created, and there was a list of 25, 30, 40 companies. I don't know, a bunch of them. No traditional geospatial companies were there at the table. Given all this experience, given the understanding of big data, you've heard me say this more times than you care. This community was big data before big data was cool, but now people are trying to regulate big data, and this community is not really participating in it in my sense in any meaningful way. And I think so. You're going to be, if you're not at the table, you're going to be stuck with whatever comes from the table, and that may or may not suit what you're doing, and you may not be able to articulate why you need to be treated differently.
And I also struggle with whether we've worked so hard to say we're different and we're geospatial is special, and I think that's starting to come to a place where it hurts us, right? Like where we're like, we have to have geo AI. I don't think so. I think we have AI and we do geospatial applications with it. It's not a different thing. It's in our data it's just another data type in a data portfolio, and I think this sort of off in the special category has harmed us in places like we're not in that necessarily in those conversations.
Hey, yeah, I certainly agree with that, and that discussion has been going on for years, right? I mean, I in one way I agree with it, and the other way I do think, and I've created my legal career around this, so maybe I'm smoking what I'm selling, but I do believe that there are unique legal issues associated with geospatial that are more complex with other types of data. So from a privacy standpoint, I'm not going to give you my health data. I'm not going to give you my credit card information. I give you my location here, right? Every time I go out into public. But who collects that and how they use it is different. And so how you develop a law that treats you being able to see me now and someone else being able to connect my location and use it is a really hard thing for people to get their mind around or to figure out how to legislate. So I think the same with how geospatial products and services are created. Data from a variety of sources throughout the ecosystem, from industry, from open source, from government, raises complex issues that I don't think until AI, many organizations have had to deal with.
All right, I actually have no idea how much time we have left now. Eddie?
Yeah, 15.
Okay, all right, we can talk for a while. All right, I mean, we take questions in a couple. Yeah, where you want to?
No, if there's a question, yeah.
I mean, I do want to just I do think geospatial is really unique and important, but I think being off, creating that wall there has led to some unintended consequences. And, we're not always in the CIO discussions. We're not always in the at the table.
No, and we've had this discussion before. I'll send you something and say, have you been part of this? And a lot of times they're not getting invited. When I was on NGAC, we went to, there was a federal privacy group of privacy officers within a bunch of different organizations. There wasn't anyone from the geospatial community there. Now, the agencies who were in FGDC were there, but the people who were representing those agencies didn't know anything about geospatial. So we went in and gave a presentation on location privacy. The federal government has a lot of location data, right? And so one of the challenges is, and I see Derek in the room. Derek, you're trying to have even the open data law or the Geospatial Data Act. It says we want you to do this. We want you to make data open. We want you to use geospatial data on the platform, but make sure you protect privacy. Right? It's just a throwaway sentence, right? It's just and go figure that part out. And that's really hard to do with no guidance, right? And so those are the sort of things that I think this community can really benefit. Not only should they be there, but could really benefit by getting clarity and working through some of those issues and giving their perspective. Because I can tell you, there organizations, I call it the privacy industrial complex. There are organizations that create issues around privacy and location privacy, and then they sell services to try to figure out how to correct it, right? And so there's an incentive for them to find ways that location privacy can be breached. And it's getting harder and harder to say otherwise, but you've got to look, privacy is just one example where you're weighing the public good, the benefit of the public good versus the rest of individuals. And if the public good is someone getting a free Starbucks coupon as compared to someone's location being stalked or something, that's one benefit. But the work that you do is much bigger than that. But if you're not participating in the privacy discussions and talking about those things, then people don't appreciate that.
All right, maybe one last question for me. What if you had one recommendation either for people or a thought on, what is something from a legal perspective that might impact this community that we're not expecting or thinking about?
And we've talked about AI, and I think that's a big one. The other area that I think is really interesting is what's happening around the convergence of national security and privacy, particularly around data. And there was a executive order that came out in terms of being able to sell sensitive data and personal data to a list of countries that we probably wouldn't sell to anyways. And then that became a law recently that I believe Biden just signed it. But there's this growing recognition that foreign actors are finding ways to collect location information of U.S. citizens, and not just, TikTok, although that's an example, but where people are going, and they're running that through their own AI systems and building models, and I'm not smart enough to know what they're doing, but they're doing a lot with it. So there's this tension. It's not just coming from the privacy side, it's coming from the national security side. You've always had that with commercial remote sensing, right? And concerns about the data that's being collected from there. You started to get it around drones because of DJI and the concern that data was being collected by Chinese drones and that was being sent back to China. Now you got it with TikTok and data being collected there. It's a growing concern, and I don't think anyone's really thinking about it from a broader perspective on, okay, how is that going to hinder what we do? Because you can speak to this better than I. Every time there's another obstacle or law that someone needs to take a look at, and you go to your lawyer and say, "Can I do this?" They have to go look at something else, right? You need to talk to this person, right? The national security lawyer, right? So that's something that I find interesting that's developing, and I don't know how it's going to play out, and it may not impact, certainly won't impact everyone in this room, but I expect that some folks, it will have an impact on what they do.
Awesome. Thank you. I think we'll take some questions, and if we have extra time, we can chat some more.
We have a walking mic or
Hi, Everett.
it does.
Thank you. I'm Everett Hinckley from the Forest Service, and 2 weeks ago, hi Doug, we had a AI and machine learning forum at USGS focused on the use of this technology for geospatial capabilities. So you two today, it was just wow. Lots of really intriguing, thoughtful challenges that we're facing here. And one of the things that I proposed 2 weeks ago was that we create a community of practice in the federal government looking at application of AI and machine learning to geospatial activities. So we may go forward with that. We'll see. Josh, I sent you an email earlier today about that. But yeah, I think, the pace of technology always outpaces our ability to build legal frameworks to help support the use of that technology. It's the same with unmanned aircraft that you just mentioned. So, that's a challenge for the government. And, the other thing is looking at the laws that are put in place. We actually build policies that are based on those laws, like the Geospatial Data Act. So I'm currently writing policy that ties into those acts so that people that work in the Forest Service know what they're supposed to be doing or not doing. So you touched on a lot of really good points here today. I really appreciated this presentation. It was really topical and timely, so thank you.
Can you make an interesting point, and it's one that I've experienced, right? So when I first started practicing law, the internet was just becoming popular, and I actually did a podcast with a colleague of mine who's was in the Virginia General Assembly at the time, and there was a real decision to hands-off approach at the government level on the internet to not try to regulate it. And there was some, at the edges, there were guardrails, but it wasn't trying to overly regulate. Partly because the lawmakers at the state and federal level understood that they didn't understand it, right? So they didn't even know what e-commerce, how to regulate that, how to tax that, right? So they let it go, and the internet exploded. And that was, that we've seen the benefits of that, right? And there are risks and there are bad things that have come from it. So you got to balance that. Drones, on the other hand, you need government approval to operate a drone, to fly it into space, right? And the drone industry 4, 5, 7 or 8 years ago, all this money was going into drones and it was going to be this big next thing, but you can't get government approval to do a lot of the operations that people think you should be able to do. And part of that is because of the security concerns, right? Part of it is the safety concern. So even though the laws around drones are, behind, because you needed the government approval, you haven't had the takeoff. AI is interesting because I agree, usually the law follows the technology. But for this technology, for good or for bad, the government has decided the lawmakers decided we're going to try to catch up with you. We're going to try to get ahead of you, even though we don't understand it, right? There was a Jon Stewart clip the other day interviewing senators who said, I don't understand it, but they're still in the conference rooms trying to come up with laws. So it's going to be interesting to see what impact these laws and policies have because they are trying to regulate it. They don't understand it. And it could go very bad. It could be more like drones, and it could be than like the internet. And how that plays out will have a significant impact, I think, on some of the things that people do here.
I started investigating the use of drones for the Forest Service back in 2003. And I refer to that first 10 years of the 2000s as the Wild West period and with unmanned aircraft, because no one was looking over my shoulder telling me that I couldn't do that. And, so we were out doing what we wanted to do in terms of testing out the capabilities. One thing in terms of developing appropriate laws is I don't think that lawmakers fully understand the technology or the use cases, or the potential pitfalls of the technology. And then the users don't fully understand what the laws are. They may or not be in place, or maybe they're being considered or whatever. But the two sides, like you say, need to get together and not just say, well, I'm special and go off and do my own thing.
Thanks, Everett.
I have a question. It's a question for both of you. Kevin, do you have any a link or something that people can follow? Like, you want to plug for this topic that people can, stay current with it, policy and legal issues? I don't. If you reach, I'm on LinkedIn. If you reach out to LinkedIn, I post a lot on these issues on LinkedIn. I write a lot about it. I'll take this opportunity. I've also just, it hasn't been released yet, but I'm publishing a book on geospatial law and ethics that will come out in August. And it was based on the class that I teach. And it's really intended for geospatial professionals to sort of highlight what these issues are, so that you can then go talk to your lawyer, as I said, and say, okay, here's my concern on intellectual property. Here's my concern around liability. Can you help get me comfortable that I can do this? Or how do I protect myself contractually? There's not a lot. I mean, I've been doing this for a bunch of years. I know most of you have probably seen me more times than you care to. I think that's a reflection of this community not, as I said at the beginning, not appreciating the legal aspects of what's going on. But I do probably too much on LinkedIn. So if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, I connect with everyone. But so I'd happy to do that as a start. Great. And buy the book. Okay. And then for you, Josh, how should people, or what's the best way for people to get involved in FGDC? And do you want to plug the Federal Register notice that's about to come out?
I do. Thank you, Carla. So if you're interested in FGDC, I think we have a website, but we have a couple of we have a Geospatial Data Act working group and a theme working group. So if you're not involved in that, or reach out to me directly and I can help you there. And then we are working on a strategic plan for the National Spatial Data Infrastructure that we expect to be out in about the next 3 weeks for public comment through the Federal Register. So we'll have a Federal Register notice out, and we'll also send that out proactively to as many folks as we can for feedback. But that's a huge opportunity to impact where we're looking to go in the next 10 years geospatially as a nation. So I'd encourage you guys to do that. Thank you, Carl.
Yeah, no problem.
One more.
Okay.
And Kevin is available for lunch Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday if you're...
Good.
With respect to supporting and growing the open source tool usage and open data, what policies or laws are there for the federal government that say a certain percentage of their projects or their funding for contracts should be focused in this direction?
There. I don't.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and there may be people in this room that know more about this than I do, but I'd say things like the Open Data Act. I mean, I don't know that there's a requirement necessarily in percentages for acquisition, but certainly, requirements and mandates for us to publish our data, openly and in open formats and follow open standards and things like that. I'm not as certain about the open software versus COTS and where that fits in, but there might be somebody here that knows more than I do.
Yeah, I don't know of any sort of what you've described in terms of 20% of the budget needs to be open data or open source. There may be, I don't think there are any laws. Derek, do you know of any laws that requires that? I mean, there may be policies within organizations, but is there a law that...
Tough to get it.
Yeah.
But that isn't a percentage though, right? That's just that just encourages organizations.
Fine.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate it. Thanks, Kevin. This was great.